You've probably heard of the Rothschilds, the banking dynasty that financed Europe's wars and rewrote its politics. But few remember the family who did the same in the East. They were called the Sassoons, exiles turned financiers, merchants turned monarchs of trade. They built fortunes from goods the world demanded and governments condemned. They mastered the global economy before it even had a name. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. The Sassoon story begins not in London or New York, but in Baghdad in the old Ottoman Empire, at the turn of the 19th century. David Sassoon was born in 1792, the son of the treasurer to the Ottoman governor. For generations, the Sassoons had been successful Jewish merchants, managing trade routes that stretched from Basra to Persia. But that prosperity came at a cost. In the volatile politics of empire, wealth always drew suspicion. When power shifted, the Sassoons fell out of favor. Persecution followed. In 1829, David fled Baghdad with nothing but his family, his faith, and his knowledge of trade. He ended up in Bombay, a humid, crowded colonial outpost under British control. It wasn't the empire's capital, but it was its artery, the link between Britain's mills and Asia's markets. For a refugee, it was both exile and opportunity. David Sassoon arrived with no formal education, no title, and no land. But what he did have was priceless experience. He understood supply chains before the word existed. He knew what the British wanted, what India could produce, and what China would buy. And above all, he knew that where there is instability, there is profit. If you have the courage to stay when others flee. He began small. Cotton yarn, textiles, anything that could move through the ports. But he did something different. He built trust across cultures. He hired Jewish, Indian, and Arab merchants, spoke multiple languages, and understood that relationships, not contracts, built empires. In a city divided by caste, creed, and colonial hierarchy, Sassoon created something radical, a network that ignored borders. And then came the product that would make him rich and infamous: opium. The British East India Company had long monopolized the trade, exporting opium grown in India to China, where addiction was widespread and growing. The Chinese government had banned the drug, but demand never disappeared. Smuggling became the shadow economy of the 19th century, and then Sassoon stepped into it with precision, not chaos. He didn't run opium dens or smuggling boats himself. He financed, insured, and supplied the trade. The banker behind the merchant behind the empire. His company, David Sassoon & Co., became a financial and logistical backbone of Britain's China trade. By the 1840s, his ships were sailing under the Union Jack, his warehouses filled with goods bound for the East. People usually imagine the invisible hand as a magic force that makes everything work automatically. Politicians quote it, economists defend it, and free market fans treat it like a prophecy. But the irony is that Adam Smith never meant it that way. In fact, if he watched modern markets, he would probably be shocked at how people use his words to justify greed, monopoly, and exploitation. Smith was warning us subtly, carefully, and repeatedly that markets only work when human beings behave with restraint. And restraint, he believed, is not automatic. As the Industrial Revolution gained speed, the world around him was changing faster than any philosopher before him had ever witnessed. Factories were rising. Workers were flooding cities. Merchants were growing richer. For the first time, money began to move faster than society's old moral rules could keep up with. Smith saw opportunity, but he also saw danger. And part 2 of this story is where the danger becomes impossible to ignore. Smith observed merchants acting in ways that hurt the public, even while insisting they were helping it. They raised prices even when competition existed. They lobbied governments to ban foreign goods so they could control the market. They teamed up in private meetings not to innovate, but to fix prices behind closed doors. Smith wrote that businessmen rarely gather without conspiring against the public. He knew the problem wasn't markets, it was the people inside them. And he kept pointing to one theme: self-interest can be helpful, but only when it is balanced by morality and laws. This is the part that modern readers skip over. Smith believed self-interest should be restricted. He supported laws against monopolies. He warned that corporations, if left unchecked, would grow too powerful. He believed the state must protect workers from exploitation. But somewhere in the centuries that followed, these warnings were turned upside down. People began quoting one sentence about an invisible hand while ignoring the hundreds of pages where he explained how easily markets can fail. Imagine the world Smith lived in. No digital markets, no billion-dollar companies, no global networks where one decision in London could ruin lives in India or America. And yet, even in that simpler world, he was terrified of concentrated power. He believed real competition depends on fairness, transparency, and rules. And without rules, the invisible hand stops working. It doesn't guide the market anymore, it chokes it. Part 2 is the turning point. It's where Smith stops sounding like the father of capitalism and starts sounding like its critic. He describes how greed can blind judgment, how businesses can manipulate governments, how workers, being the weaker side, must be protected, and how society collapses when profit becomes a religion. The invisible hand, in his view, wasn't a miracle. It was a fragile possibility, a hope that people would act decently without Nina.